I missed my dad's retirement party for a promotion. He framed the article about me instead. People will tell you, for years, that you can make it up to them later, and the terrible thing is that most of them mean it when they say it. I found that out in my father's garage in Elmhurst, Illinois, 4 years after the fact, staring at a framed newspaper clipping hanging above his workbench. Dated the same week I'd told him I wasn't coming to the fire department banquet hall on Butterfield Road to watch him retire after 34 years. What I did wrong is simple enough that I don't need to dress it up for you. My father asked me to be in a room for the biggest night of his working life, and I chose a different room instead, because the other room had my name and a headline in it. I want to say, before I get any further into this, that I'm not telling you this story so you'll rush to forgive me on my behalf, and I'd ask you to actually resist that instinct if you feel it starting early. Because I don't think I'd earned it at the point in the story where you'd feel it, and I'm honestly not sure I've fully earned it by the end either. I did something specific and deliberate to a man who spent 34 years running into other people's emergencies and still found time, every single night, to check in on mine. I'd rather you sit with that plainly for a while, before I let you feel any better about it. My name is Nora Alcott. I'm 35 years old, I live in Chicago, and I'm a senior investigative reporter at a major metro paper, a title I've held for 4 years now, a title that exists, in the most literal and specific sense, because of a decision I made on a Thursday in October that I am going to walk you through in exhausting detail, because I think the detail is the only thing that makes this story honest rather than just sad. Let me back up. You need to understand who my father actually was before any of this happened, because if I start with the night itself, you'll misunderstand the man I did this to, and I've spent enough years letting people misunderstand him. I won't do it again here. My father, Walter Alcott, spent 34 years as a firefighter with the Elmhurst Fire Department, the last 11 of them as a lieutenant at Station 2 on York Street. He was not, by his own account or anyone else's, an ambitious man in the way I would come to define ambition for myself. He turned down 2 chances at captain over the years because, he told me once, the paperwork would have pulled him off the truck, and he'd joined the department to be on the truck, not behind a desk. He worked the same rotation for most of 3 decades, 24 hours on and 48 off, and he had a habit, every single shift he worked, of calling my mother at exactly 7 each night, right after dinner service, at the station, just to say goodnight to whoever picked up the phone at home. My mother, most nights. Me on the nights she was out. My younger brother Dean on the nights I wasn't home either. He called it checking the perimeter, a small joke that had stopped being funny to any of us by the time I was in high school, and that he told anyway, every single night for over 30 years, because the joke was never really the point. The call was the point. I remember, distinctly, one of those calls from when I was maybe 16, home alone on a Friday night, while my mother was at a school event and Dean was at a friend's house. My father called at 7 exactly, the way he always did, and I answered short and distracted, halfway through homework I didn't want to be doing, and told him everything was fine before he'd even finished asking. He let a small pause sit on the line and said, "You don't have to sound fine, Nora, you just have to tell me if something's wrong." Nothing was wrong that night, as it happened, but I've thought about that sentence more than almost any other piece of advice I received as a teenager. Because it wasn't advice at all. It was just an offer, made quietly and repeated for 30 years. In case I ever needed to take him up on it. Most nights I didn't. The offer never once stopped being made. He had a specific, recurring habit that mattered more than I understood at the time. Whenever I did anything publicly notable, no matter how small, a byline in my college newspaper, a third-place ribbon at a middle school science fair, a mention in the local paper for a fundraiser I organized in high school. He'd clip it out, however small the clipping, and pin it to a corkboard in the garage above his workbench, next to a corkboard he kept for Dean's baseball stats, and a smaller one for my mother's church bulletin mentions. By the time I left for college, that corkboard held probably 40 clippings, most of them yellowed, most of them, if I'm honest, embarrassingly minor achievements that he'd treated with a weight I found almost suffocating as a teenager. I used to tell him, more than once, that he didn't need to keep every single thing, that it was starting to look like a shrine, and he'd say, every time, "I like knowing where to look for proof you're doing all right," a sentence I heard as sentimental at best and controlling at worst, and that I now understand as the truest description of unconditional love I've ever been given by anyone. The family dynamic worth being honest about is this. My mother worked as a school secretary and mostly deferred to my father on anything involving money or long-term decisions, which meant my father's opinion carried more weight in our house than either of theirs would have carried alone. My brother Dean stayed in Elmhurst, took over a small landscaping business, married young, and settled into exactly the kind of life my father had lived himself, steady, local, unremarkable in the specific way my father found more admirable than remarkable. Dean used to tease me, gently, growing up, that I was Dad's proof project, the one who was supposed to demonstrate that the Alcott name could make it somewhere beyond Elmhurst, and I don't think Dean meant it unkindly. But I absorbed it as a kind of assignment anyway, one I took increasingly seriously the older I got, until by my late 20s the assignment had quietly become the entire architecture of how I understood my own worth. I left for Northwestern at 18 and never really came back, not in any meaningful sense, and by the time I was in my late 20s. Working my way up through two smaller papers before landing the Metro job in Chicago, I had built an entire identity around being the one who got out, the one whose life required explaining to people at Elmhurst reunions, the one who'd made something of herself in a way that implicitly, even if I never said it out loud, suggested my father hadn't made quite as much of himself in return. That's not a fact. That's a story I told myself for over a decade, and it's the story that made everything else in this account possible. There were three specific things about my father that mattered more than I understood at the time, things I want you to hold on to, because they all come back later in this story in a way I didn't see coming. The first was the corkboard in the garage. The second was the 7 o'clock call, the checking the perimeter joke he never once let go stale, even when none of us laughed at it anymore. The third was a phrase he used, always in the same even tone, whenever I called him stressed about work, about deadlines, about whatever fire I was putting out at whichever paper I worked for at the time. "You don't have to prove it to me twice, Nora. I already believe you." I used to find that sentence almost dismissive, like he wasn't taking my stress seriously enough. I understand it differently now. He wasn't dismissing the stress. He was telling me every single time that his opinion of me didn't require the achievement I was chasing in order to hold steady. I didn't need the sentence at the time. I needed it more, later, than I ever let myself admit. My father announced his retirement date in August of my 4th year at the Metro paper, October the 14th, a Saturday 34 years to the week since he'd started at Station 2. The department was throwing him a banquet at the VFW Hall on Butterfield Road, the kind of retirement send-off that gets planned 6 months in advance, because half the guest list is other firefighters' families who need their own shifts covered to attend. My mother mailed me a physical invitation in September, printed, with my father's photo from his rookie year on the front next to a recent one. A detail I know now she'd chosen specifically because she thought I'd like the visual contrast, the before and after of 34 years condensed onto one card. I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet and told her, on the phone, that of course I'd be there, that I wouldn't miss it for anything. I remember, distinctly, sitting with that invitation the week it arrived, running my thumb over the two photographs, and feeling something close to real anticipation about the night itself. The idea of watching my father, finally off shift for good, surrounded by 3 decades of colleagues who all had their own version of a story about him. I told a coworker that week, unprompted, that my dad was retiring soon and that I was flying out for it, using language that made it sound like a settled fact rather than an intention, because at that point, 10 days before Priscilla's phone call, it genuinely was. The wrong I did, the one this whole story is built around, started with a phone call from my editor, a woman named Priscilla Vance, on the first Monday of October, 10 days before the banquet. Priscilla told me that the paper's editorial board had decided, after an 18-month evaluation period tied to an investigative series I'd led on a municipal pension scandal, to promote me to senior investigative reporter, the youngest person to hold that title at the paper in over a decade. The promotion came with a formal announcement dinner the paper was hosting on October the 14th. The same Saturday as my father's banquet, a black tie event at the Drake Hotel where I'd be introduced publicly to the paper's board, its major advertisers, and a handful of city officials whose relationships would matter enormously to my career for years afterward. Priscilla told me the date wasn't movable. It had been locked in with the Drake's events team for months, tied to the board's quarterly meeting schedule, and asked me directly whether I could be there. I want to describe exactly what I told myself in the 3 days after that call, because I think the reasoning matters more than the guilt does, if you actually want to understand how a person does something like this. I told myself that my father's retirement banquet was one of dozens of retirement banquets the Elmhurst Fire Department would throw that decade, an event that would be warm and well-attended with or without me, while the Drake Hotel dinner was a once-in-a-career introduction to people who controlled the trajectory of my professional life for the next 20 years. I told myself that my father, of all people, would understand, that a man who'd spent 34 years explaining to his own kids why he'd missed birthdays and recitals for calls that couldn't wait would recognize, better than anyone, what it meant to choose the job. I told myself I could make it up to him. I believed genuinely in the moment that all 3 of those things were true. I also told myself something else, quieter, that I didn't say out loud to anyone in those 3 days, but that I think was closer to the actual engine of the decision than any of the reasons I gave voice to. I told myself that if I skipped my own promotion dinner for my father's retirement, some part of the board would notice the absence, would read it as a lack of seriousness about the new title, would wonder whether I understood what the job actually required of me going forward. I was, underneath the language of obligation and gratitude I used with everyone else, afraid that choosing my father publicly, in front of people who mattered to my career, would mark me as someone whose ambition had a ceiling built into it. I've never said that sentence out loud to my father. I'm saying it now, to you, because I think it's the truest version of the reasoning, and I promised you the undramatized version of my own cruelty rather than the flattering one. I called him on a Wednesday night 8 days before both events, and I remember exactly where I was standing, my apartment kitchen in Logan Square, a glass of wine on the counter I hadn't touched yet. I told him about the promotion first, and he was as proud as I'd expected, genuinely delighted, asking questions about the pension series, about what the new title would mean for my beat. And then I told him about the conflict, and I heard the pause on the line before he said anything. A pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds, and that I have replayed more times than I can count. The 14th, he said, and it wasn't a question exactly, more like a man confirming a date he already knew by heart. That's the same night as the banquet. I told him it was, and that I was sick about it, and that I didn't know what to do. That last part was a lie. I already knew what I was going to do. I was calling him. I understand now. Not to ask his advice, but to get his blessing for a decision I'd already made, the same way you ask permission for something after you've already done it, hoping the asking will retroactively make it feel less like a choice. You should go to your dinner, he said, and his voice was steady, no edge in it that I could detect. Though I've wondered since how much of that steadiness was performed for my benefit in the moment. This is a big deal, Nora. Bigger than anything I'm doing at that VFW hall. Your mother and Dean will be there. I'll have plenty of people in the room. I told him I loved him, and that I'd make it up to him, and he said, "You don't owe me a makeup. Go be great at your dinner." And we hung up, and I remember feeling, in that moment, an almost total relief. The specific relief of being told by the person you've wronged that you haven't actually wronged them at all. I chose to believe that relief was the whole truth of the conversation. It would be 4 years before I understood it wasn't. There was an off-ramp in that stretch of days, and I want to be honest that I saw it clearly and chose not to take it. My younger brother Dean called me 2 days after that conversation with my father, and he didn't waste time getting to the point. You know you could ask the paper to move the intro to a different table, right? Show up late to the dinner, get there for the actual meal, skip the cocktail hour. The banquet starts at 6. Your thing doesn't really matter until people are seated for dinner around 8. You could do both if you actually wanted to. I told Dean it wasn't that simple, that the board dinner had a formal seating chart. Remarks scheduled for the cocktail hour specifically because that's when the advertisers were most attentive, that showing up late to my own introduction would look worse than not showing up to Dad's banquet at all. Dean was quiet for a second and then said, "That's not really an answer to what I asked you," which was true, and which I didn't have a real response to, and which I let end the conversation anyway. Dean called back one more time, the night before both events, and this call was shorter and harder than the first. "Just so you know how it's going to look," he said, "there's 40 people driving in for this from 3 different states. Guys Dad worked with in the 80s. And you're going to be 40 minutes away in a ballroom talking about yourself." I told him that wasn't fair, that this wasn't about talking about myself, that this dinner represented 4 years of work he didn't fully understand the stakes of. "Maybe," Dean said. "Or maybe you just don't want to explain to a room full of your bosses why you left early for your dad's retirement party at a VFW hall. I think you're more scared of that than you're willing to say." I hung up angrier at him than I'd been at anyone in a long time. Mostly, I understand now, because he'd said the true thing out loud that I'd been careful not to say even to myself. I skipped the cocktail hour of nothing, obviously, because I never intended to try the version Dean suggested. I went to the Drake Hotel on October the 14th in a black dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, stood in a receiving line shaking hands with the paper's publisher and 3 city council members, and gave brief remarks about the pension series to a room of people who applauded politely and moved on to their entrees. My father's banquet, 40 minutes away in Elmhurst, started at the same hour. My mother texted me a photo around 7:30, my father at a podium, mid-speech, the fire chief and 24 firefighters in dress uniform standing behind him, and I remember glancing at it during a lull in my own dinner, feeling something sharp and quick in my chest. And then putting my phone away because a city councilwoman was asking me a question about my next investigative target. I didn't call my father that night, or the next morning. I texted him around noon the following day, something short, "How was it?" I saw Mom's photo, looked like a great turnout, and he texted back a few hours later, "Good crowd. Chief gave a nice speech." Proud of you too, for your own night. 6 words at the end that I remember reading twice, trying to decide whether there was anything underneath them, and deciding, because it was easier, that there wasn't. I called my mother 2 days later, mostly to ask how the banquet had actually gone in more detail than a text could cover, and she gave me a full account, who'd spoken, what the chief had said about my father's career, a moment near the end where several of the younger firefighters had presented him with a restored antique helmet from the department's history. A gesture she described as having visibly moved him in a way she said she'd rarely seen. I asked her, carefully, whether anyone had mentioned my absence. She was quiet for a beat too long before saying, "A couple people asked where you were. I told them you had a work thing you couldn't move." I asked if my father had said anything about it to her, afterward, in private. "Not really," she said. "He just got quiet for a bit in the car. I didn't push him on it. That's not really how your father processes things anyway." The paper ran a profile on me 2 weeks later, a full page with my photo, titled "The Youngest Investigator on the Beat," detailing the pension series and the new title. I sent my father a link. He texted back, "Proud of you, kiddo. 3 words. No more." And I read something into the brevity of that text that I couldn't quite name at the time, and have thought about since more than almost anything else in this story. For the better part of the next 4 years, my relationship with my father existed in a kind of managed, functional distance that neither of us ever discussed directly. I called on Sundays, most weeks, 15 or 20 minutes, mostly about Dean's kids or my mother's garden, or whatever minor drama was happening at Station 2 among firefighters he'd half retired from thinking about but still heard news of through old colleagues. I visited Elmhurst for holidays, briefer each year, usually driving back to the city the same night rather than staying over the way I used to. I told myself, in the language I'd gotten good at using with myself by then, that my father and I had simply settled into an adult relationship. A phrase I used once at a work dinner when a colleague asked whether my parents were proud of my career. And I remember delivering it with the same practiced ease I used for most sentences about my personal life by then. Technically true, structurally evasive. My career, in that same stretch, accelerated in almost every way a career can accelerate. I broke 2 more major investigative series, won a regional press award, got approached twice by national outlets with offers I ultimately turned down out of loyalty to a paper that, in hindsight, I think I stayed loyal to, partly because leaving would have required examining what exactly I'd built that loyalty on. I bought a condo in Logan Square with a home office that had a wall I'd started filling, slowly, with my own framed clippings, a habit I never once, in 4 years, connected consciously to the corkboard in my father's garage, though I understand now exactly where the impulse came from. I remember a friend visiting that apartment once, looking at the wall and asking, half joking, whether I'd inherited that particular habit from someone, and I remember laughing it off and changing the subject, because some part of me already knew the answer and didn't want to say it out loud yet. There were cracks in that 4-year stretch, small enough that I filed each one away rather than examine it directly. A year and a half in, my mother mentioned on a Sunday call that my father's knees had gotten bad enough that he'd stopped doing the yard work himself, that Dean had taken over mowing the lawn on weekends, and I said something sympathetic and didn't ask a single follow-up question about what bad enough actually meant. 2.5 years in, I let a call from my father go to voicemail during a source interview and didn't listen to the message for 6 days, and when I finally did, it was just him asking whether I remembered the name of a diner we used to go to on Saturday mornings when I was small. Nothing urgent, nothing that needed me. Which I told myself proved I hadn't actually missed anything important. 3 years in, driving through Elmhurst for a family funeral that had nothing to do with him, I passed Station 2 on York Street and saw a new lieutenant's name posted on the sign out front where my father's used to be, and I sat at the stoplight outside it for longer than the light required. And I still didn't call him that night, telling myself I'd do it the following week. I didn't. There was one more crack, closer to the 4-year mark, that I've thought about more than the others since. It was my birthday, and my father called, as he always did, at exactly 7 in the evening, the same 7 o'clock he'd used for the perimeter check my entire life. A habit that had apparently outlived the job that originally required it. I let it go to voicemail because I was at a work happy hour I didn't want to leave, and I texted him instead, in the middle of something, "Call you tomorrow. Love you." And I did call the next day. But only after he'd already left a voicemail the night before that I listened to on my walk home. Just him. Singing happy birthday slightly off-key the way he'd done every year of my life. Finishing with, "All right, that's the whole song. Love you, kiddo. Call whenever," delivered in the same even tone he used for almost everything. I saved that voicemail. I still have it. I've never told him that. I want to be honest that I wasn't unhappy during those 4 years, which is the detail that troubles me most in retrospect. I wasn't lying awake at night riddled with guilt about my father. I was, by almost every external measure, thriving, respected at work, financially comfortable for the first time in my life, dating someone steady, building a version of adulthood that looked, from the outside, entirely successful. The distance between my father and me didn't announce itself as a wound most days. It just quietly became the shape of how I understood our relationship to work, a low hum in the background of an otherwise full life, easy enough to explain away in a single sentence at a dinner party and never think about again until the next Sunday call reminded me it was still there. I also want to be honest about one more thing from that stretch, because I think it's relevant to what came later. Somewhere around the 3-year mark, I started dating someone, a man named Elliot. And I remember bringing him to Elmhurst for Thanksgiving that year and watching my father with him. Watching the two of them talk easily about the Bears, about Elliot's own father, a retired postal worker in Rockford, and feeling a strange, unnamed jealousy watching my father be that relaxed, that present, with someone who wasn't me. I didn't examine that feeling closely at the time. I understand now that it wasn't jealousy of Elliot at all. It was a recognition, buried under 4 years of managed distance, that my father still had all of that ease and warmth fully intact, and that I was the only person in the room who'd stopped fully receiving it. The discovery that finally broke this open didn't come from a document or a phone call from a stranger, the way I understand these things sometimes happen. It came from my mother, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 4 years and 5 months after the retirement banquet. In a call that started as an ordinary check-in and became something else entirely about 11 minutes in. "Your father wants to clean out the garage this spring," she told me, in the middle of a sentence about something unrelated, her tone shifting slightly in a way I noticed but didn't immediately understand. "He's been going through the corkboards. He found something he wants you to see, but he won't send a photo. He says you have to see it in person." I asked her what it was, and she said, carefully, "I think you should just come out here, Nora. It's been a while since you've been in that garage anyway." I drove to Elmhurst that Saturday, 5 days later, the first unscheduled visit I'd made to my parents' house in longer than I wanted to admit to myself in the car on the way over. The drive itself, 38 minutes on a clear morning, gave me too much time to speculate about what I might be walking into, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd worked myself into a state I wasn't proud of. Irritated, almost, at being summoned without explanation. A reaction I understand now said more about my own guilt than about anything my mother had actually done wrong by. Asking. My father was in the garage when I arrived, exactly where I expected him to be, going through a box of old department memorabilia at his workbench. He didn't make a production of it. He simply gestured toward the wall above the bench, where the corkboard I remembered from childhood had been replaced at some point in the last 4 years with a single large frame professionally done. Matted, glass-covered, holding a full newspaper page. My paper. My photo. The profile from 4 years earlier, the youngest investigator on the beat, framed and hung in the exact spot where the corkboard used to be, dated the same week as his retirement banquet. I had it done the week after it ran, he said, not turning around from the box he was sorting. Took it to the framer on Vine Street. Cost more than I wanted to admit to your mother, if I'm honest. I stood there looking at my own name in that headline, hung with more care than most of the family photos in the house, and I asked him, because I didn't know what else to ask, why he'd never mentioned it in 4 years of Sunday phone calls. Because I didn't want you thinking about the banquet every time you thought about that article, he said. I wanted the article to just be its own thing. Something good, on its own, not tangled up in the other night. He finally turned around, and his expression wasn't anything close to what I'd braced myself for. Not hurt, not accusation, just a kind of settled, ordinary calm. The same calm he'd used on the phone 4 years earlier telling me to go to my dinner. I'm proud of that piece, Nora. I've read it probably 40 times. I know you think I'm still upset about the banquet. I want you to hear me say I'm not, and I want you to actually believe me this time, instead of just being relieved I said it. That sentence, believe me this time instead of just being relieved, landed harder than almost anything else in this story, because it told me, plainly, that he'd known exactly what that relief on the phone 4 years earlier had actually been. He'd clocked it in real time and let me have it anyway. I want to tell you the framed article was the whole discovery, the whole reason this story exists. But it wasn't. It was the door. What was behind the door came about 20 minutes later, when my mother, setting out coffee at the kitchen table, mentioned almost offhandedly that she hoped I'd finally gotten things straightened out with the lawyer situation from a few years back, a sentence that meant absolutely nothing to me, and that I asked her to explain twice before she understood. With visible alarm, that I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. The pension series, she said slowly, watching my face for recognition that wasn't coming. The defamation letter. From the Deputy Comptroller's office. Your father never told you? I called my old editor, Priscilla Vance, that same evening from my parents' driveway, my hands cold on the steering wheel, and asked her directly whether she remembered a defamation threat connected to the pension series, the story that had gotten me promoted in the first place. She went quiet for a moment, the way people go quiet when they're deciding how much of a decade-old confidence they're allowed to break, and then she told me the truth. 8 months before my promotion, a deputy comptroller named Russell Hain, whose financial mismanagement had anchored the second installment of my series, had retained an attorney and sent the paper a formal defamation demand, threatening a 6-figure lawsuit over a single-sourced quote he claimed had been fabricated. The paper's legal department had taken it seriously enough to pull the story's supporting documents for review, and Priscilla told me that for close to 3 weeks, my entire career at that paper had hung on whether a confidential source I'd protected, a former city employee who'd since moved out of state and stopped returning calls, could be located and would go on record to confirm the quote before Hain's attorney's deadline passed. We found the source, Priscilla said. Eventually, but it was close. Nora, closer than you ever knew, because the board decided not to loop you in while it was live, Standard practice. Keep the reporter out of the legal exposure conversation until there's something concrete to tell them. I always assumed someone told you afterward, once it resolved. I told her nobody had. She was quiet again, and then said, "Then I don't actually know how it resolved so cleanly, that fast." I remember being surprised at the time that Haynes' attorney dropped it as quickly as he did, given how aggressive the initial letter was. I asked Priscilla whether she remembered anything else about how the threat had ended, and she said there'd been a brief internal memo, at the time, noting that Haynes' attorney had withdrawn the demand following an informal community resolution process initiated by the subject, language she remembered finding oddly bureaucratic for what should have been a straightforward legal capitulation. I remember thinking, at the time, that it read like somebody had talked him down outside the legal system entirely, she said. I never chased it further. We were just relieved it was over. She paused, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "You should ask your father for the details, if he's willing to give them." I'd be curious myself, honestly, after all these years. I asked my father, back in the garage, holding my phone with Priscilla's call still ringing in my ears, whether he knew anything about a man named Russell Hayne. He set down the tool he was holding, slowly, the way he used to set things down before delivering news he'd clearly been carrying alone for a while. Russell Haynes' brother-in-law worked out of Station 4 for 11 years, my father said. Fella named Pete Voss. I knew him, not well, but well enough. Pete called me about 6 months after your promotion, said his brother-in-law was making noise about suing your paper. Said he thought Russell was mostly angry and mostly broke and would probably drop it if somebody helped him feel like he'd been heard rather than steamrolled by a big city reporter. He paused. So I asked Pete to set up a meeting. Sat down with Russell Hayne myself at a diner off Route 83, told him I was your father. Told him I understood being embarrassed in public by something true, and told him that suing a reporter for doing accurate reporting on public corruption was going to cost him more in legal fees than he'd ever recover. And that I'd rather he let it go than watch it ruin 2 families instead of 1. I asked him if that was it, if a conversation at a diner was the entire explanation for a defamation threat that had apparently evaporated inside 3 weeks. He shook his head. Not entirely. He wanted something to walk away with. Some acknowledgement he wasn't just being ignored. So I told him I'd make sure a letter went to the comptroller's office, on his behalf, requesting a formal review of the reporting standards that led to his section of the story, through the city's press ombudsman, legitimate process, nothing that touched your reporting, nothing that would ever reach you. It cost me about $600 in certified mail and 2 afternoons of my time. And I never told the paper I was involved. Because I didn't want anyone thinking your promotion had an asterisk on it. It didn't. Your reporting was accurate. I checked, myself, before I ever sat down with that man, because I wasn't about to defend work I hadn't verified was solid. I sat down at my father's workbench, because I didn't trust my legs to hold me standing, and asked him the only question that mattered in that moment, why he'd never told me, in 4 years, that he'd quietly walked into a diner off Route 83 and diffused a lawsuit that could have ended my career 8 months before it actually took off. Because you would have felt like you owed me something, he said. And I didn't do it so you'd owe me. I did it because I'm your father, and that's still my job whether or not you make it to a banquet. He looked at the framed article on the wall, then back at me. I hung that thing up, not because I wanted you to feel guilty every time you saw it. I hung it up because it was true. You earned that headline. I just made sure a lawsuit that had nothing to do with the actual facts didn't take it away from you before you even got to enjoy it. I misjudged what my father was capable of doing on my behalf, and, more specifically, I misjudged my own understanding of what I owed him. Because I had spent 4 years believing the ledger between us was simple and mostly settled, that I'd hurt him once, apologized in the vaguest possible terms, and moved forward into a career he was proud of from a comfortable, uninvolved distance. The actual ledger, it turned out, ran almost entirely in the other direction. My father had not simply forgiven the banquet, he had gone on, in total silence, protecting the very career I'd chosen over him that night, at a cost to his own time and money and comfort that he never once presented to me as a debt. I thought back to the 7 o'clock calls, the checking the perimeter joke he'd never let go stale, and understood it differently, sitting in that garage, that the joke had never really been about checking whether we were safe at home. It was about a man whose entire working life required him to run toward danger for strangers, choosing, every single night for 3 decades, to first make sure the people he actually loved knew he was still thinking about them, even from a burning building's distance. I thought about the sentence he used to say, "You don't have to prove it to me twice, I already believe you," and understood, finally, that he'd meant it far more literally than I'd ever given him credit for. He hadn't needed proof to believe in me. He'd needed almost nothing from me at all, which was exactly why watching me withhold so much of myself from him for 4 years must have cost him more than he ever let on. I thought, too, about Dean's warning, the night before both events, that I was more scared of explaining my choice to my bosses than I was willing to admit. Sitting in that garage 4 years later, I understood how precisely he'd read me, and how much easier it would have been, in the moment, to hear that as an accusation rather than as the truth. I called Dean that same week, after everything with my father came out, and told him he'd been right, all those years ago, and that I was sorry I'd hung up on him angry instead of admitting it then. He said, simply, "I know. I wasn't calling to be right. I was calling because I could tell you needed someone to say it out loud before you did something you couldn't take back." I asked him whether he thought I had taken something back that couldn't be undone. He was quiet for a moment and then said no, but you got lucky that Dad's the kind of man who doesn't keep score the way most people would have. I asked Dean, that same conversation, whether he thought our father had ever, even once in those 4 years, come close to saying any of this to me directly, unprompted, rather than waiting for me to walk into the garage and ask. Dean thought about it for a while before answering. "I don't think so," he said. "I think he decided a long time ago that if you ever came back around, he wanted it to be because you wanted to, not because he'd guilted you into it with a story about a lawsuit. That's just how he's built. He'd rather lose the chance to be thanked than risk you coming back for the wrong reason." I've thought about that answer more than almost anything else Dean has ever told me, because it reframes the entire 4 years, not as 4 years my father spent quietly waiting to be noticed, but as 4 years he spent actively protecting my ability to come back on my own terms, even if that meant he might never get the chance to be thanked at all. There is no single dramatic confrontation scene in this story, because the conversation that actually mattered had already happened, in pieces, across that one Saturday afternoon in the garage, the framed article, my mother's slip about the lawyer, Priscilla's confirmation, my father's flat, unhurried account of a diner off Route 83. But there was one moment, near the end of that day, that I think of as the real reckoning, more than any of the facts themselves. I asked him, directly, whether he'd been hurt that I missed the banquet, all those years ago, underneath the calm he'd shown me on the phone and every day since. He was quiet for a long moment, longer than his usual pauses, and then he said, "Yes, for about a week." Then I decided being heard about it wasn't going to help either of us, and loving you the way I already knew how to was going to help both of us a lot more. So I picked the second thing. I've been picking it every day since. It gets easier the more you practice it. I didn't have a response to that. I still don't have a complete one. I asked him one more question before I left the garage that day, one I'd been afraid to ask directly until then, whether there had been other things, other quiet interventions or protections, that I still didn't know about. He thought about it for a moment, and then said, carefully, there might be. I'm not going to sit here and give you a full accounting like it's a ledger, Nora. That's not what any of this was for. I'm only telling you about Russell Hayne because your mother let it slip, and I wasn't going to lie to your face about it once she had. I didn't push further. I understood, in that moment, that some things were going to stay his to carry alone, whether or not I knew about them, and that pressing for a complete list would have been its own kind of taking from him. I've wondered since whether that not knowing is itself part of what he was protecting, that a father who'd spent 34 years running toward emergencies without expecting thanks from the people he pulled out of them would find it almost unbearable to be thanked at length for doing the same thing at home. The repair since that Saturday has been slower than I wanted it to be, and I've come to think that's appropriate rather than unfortunate. I asked him, a few weeks later, whether I could pay him back for the framer, for the certified mail, for the 2 afternoons he'd spent at a diner off Route 83, defending a career I'd chosen over his retirement banquet. He said no, flatly, the only time in this entire story I heard something close to firmness in his voice. That's not a debt, Nora. I don't want it repaid. I want it noticed. Those are different things, and I need you to actually understand the difference. Because if you try to pay me back for it, you're telling me you still think of what I do for you as a transaction, and 30 years of being your father. I'd like to think I've earned better than a transaction by now. What I did instead, over the following year, was smaller than a repayment, and I think more honest. I started calling on Wednesdays too, not just Sundays, no occasion required. I drove out to Elmhurst for his birthday that year and stayed the whole weekend instead of driving back the same night, sleeping in my old childhood bedroom for the first time in almost a decade. I asked him, that same weekend, if he'd come into the city for once. My paper was hosting an anniversary event for the pension series, a 5-year retrospective panel, and I wanted him in the room this time. Not framed on a wall 2 years after the fact, but actually present, watching. He came. He sat in the second row, in a sport coat my mother told me later he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and when the moderator asked me, during the Q&A, what had sustained me through the hardest parts of that investigation, I looked at him before I answered, and I told the room, honestly, that a man in the second row had quietly kept me employed through the worst 3 weeks of that story, without ever telling me it happened, and that I hadn't found out until 4 years later, and that I thought the true answer to the question was that some of us get sustained by things we don't even know are holding us up until much later. He didn't say anything afterward, not right away. He just found me at the reception and hugged me longer than he usually did, and said, near my ear, "Proud of you, kiddo." The same 3 words from that text 4 years earlier, except this time I understood exactly how much they'd always meant. I also went back to my own condo wall, the one I'd filled slowly over 4 years with my own framed clippings, and added one more piece to it. Not an article about me, but a photograph I asked my mother to dig out of an old album. My father in his dress uniform at the retirement banquet I'd missed, mid-speech, the same image she'd texted me that night without my full attention. I hung it directly across from my desk, where I'd see it every single day I sat down to write. A decision I made deliberately. The way I understand now, he'd made his own decision to frame that article deliberately. Not to punish myself with the reminder, but to keep something true and important in daily view, instead of letting it stay buried in a phone I rarely scrolled back through. I made one more gesture that spring, smaller than the others but the one my father has mentioned to me more than any of them since. I called Pete Voss, the retired firefighter from Station 4, who'd first connected my father with Russell Hayne, found his number through the department's alumni directory, and thanked him directly, on the phone, for making a call on my behalf 11 years earlier that I hadn't even known to be grateful for until months prior. Pete seemed genuinely surprised to hear from me and told me, before we hung up, "Your dad talks about you all the time at the coffee mornings we still do, the retired guys. Always has. I want you to know that, because I don't think he'd ever tell you himself." I called my father immediately after that conversation and told him what Pete had said, and he was quiet for a moment before saying, gruffly, "Pete talks too much," which is as close as my father comes to admitting something has moved him. I laughed. Actually laughed. Standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and for a second it felt like the easiest exchange we'd had in years. No distance in it at all. Just a daughter teasing her father about a friend who'd said too much. The ordinary texture of a relationship I'd spent 4 years missing without fully admitting to myself how much I missed it. I think, sometimes, about what would have happened if I'd taken Dean's suggestion that October, shown up late to the Drake but shown up early to the VFW hall. Split the night imperfectly, instead of choosing one room entirely. I don't know that it would have changed the 4 years that followed. I know it would have meant my father didn't spend a week being quietly hurt at his own retirement banquet, surrounded by 34 years of colleagues, without his daughter in the room, before deciding, alone, that the hurt wasn't worth carrying forward. That's not a decision I got to witness him make. I only got to receive the result of it, years later, framed under glass in a garage, presented to me as though it had cost him nothing at all. I don't want to end this sounding like everything between us is fully resolved, because I don't think it is, and I think claiming otherwise would be its own small dishonesty. The same kind that got me here in the first place. My father and I are closer now than we've been since I left for Northwestern 17 years ago, and I still catch myself, occasionally, calculating whether a visit home is worth the cost to a work deadline before I catch the calculation happening and override it on purpose. I don't think that instinct disappears completely once you've built a career on it. I think you just get better, slowly, at noticing it before it wins. My father turned 68 this year, and my mother mentioned recently that he's started talking. In the offhand way he talks about most things that matter to him, about wanting to take a trip out to see where I actually live and work. Not just visit for a weekend the way he has a handful of times since the garage conversation, but spend a real week in Chicago, sit in on a full day at the paper, meet the people I talk about on our Wednesday calls. I told him, when he brought it up himself a few weeks ago, that I'd clear my calendar for whatever week worked for him, no exceptions, no conflicts I'd let override it. He said, in the same even tone he's used for almost everything in this story, "I'll hold you to that. I intend to let him." The thing I'd say to you, if you recognize any part of yourself in this, is that the people who love you best rarely make you choose between them and your ambition out loud. They make the choice easy for you. On purpose. And then they quietly absorb whatever the easy choice costs them, and they do it so well that you can go years mistaking their grace for evidence that nothing was actually lost. It was lost. It's just that some people are skilled enough at love to make the loss invisible to the very person who caused it, and the debt for that skill doesn't disappear just because you never saw the bill. It just sits there, patiently, waiting for you to finally walk into a garage and look up. I think about the framer on Vine Street sometimes, a man I've never met, who spent an afternoon at some point 4 years ago matting and glazing a newspaper page for a customer who probably never explained the full story behind why it mattered so much to him. I wonder if my father told him anything at all, standing at that counter, or whether he just said, Simply that his daughter had written it. And let that be the whole of the explanation, the way he's let so much of his love for me be understood rather than stated. I think that's probably closer to the truth than anything more elaborate. My father has never needed the full story to know what mattered. He just needed to know it was mine, and that was always going to be enough for him to want it kept somewhere he'd see it every day. I picture him sometimes, driving home from that framer's shop with the piece wrapped in brown paper on the passenger seat, choosing exactly where in the garage it would go before he'd even parked the car, and I find something almost unbearably tender in that image now. A tenderness I wasn't capable of feeling toward him at all during the 4 years I spent keeping my distance. I don't know exactly what I'll do the next time a choice like that one comes up. Some future version of the Drake Hotel dinner, some future version of the VFW Hall, because I don't think those choices ever stop presenting themselves entirely. Not in a career like mine, not in a family like mine. I'd like to believe I'd choose differently now. I think the more honest answer is that I'd at least call Dean first and actually listen this time, instead of deciding in advance that I already knew what love was supposed to cost. I think that's the most honest place I can leave this, not a promise that I've become someone incapable of making the same mistake again, but a promise that I now know exactly what it costs the people who love me when I do. And that knowing it changes the weight of the decision, even if it can't guarantee which way I'll choose every single time. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.